The quiet observer, she sat in the corner, her eyes scanning the room, but her body language made it clear she was not a part of the conversation. The gathering was lively, people laughing, talking over one another, some telling stories, others exchanging quick words. It was the kind of event where everyone seemed to be competing for attention, their voices rising in volume, their energy filling every corner of the room. And in the midst of all this, she was the quiet one, watching but never fully engaging too. An outsider, she might have seemed distant, maybe even aloof, but that wasn't it. She wasn't shy, at least not in the way most people would define it. She simply preferred the quiet. She didn't need to be at the center of attention. She wasn't interested in trying to outshine anyone or dominate the conversation. It was just easier to observe. It's easier to stay out of the whirlwind of words and gestures. Her hands resting in her lap fidgeted slightly. She had never been one to make a scene, not even at events like this, as much as she appreciated being invited. She always found herself in the background, unsure of how to break into the circles of conversation. She smiled politely when someone greeted her, but she quickly returned to her quiet spot in the corner, where the noise seemed muted. It wasn't that she didn't want to be a part of the laughter or the energy of the room. She did. But there was a wall built of insecurity and fear that kept her from crossing over into the noise. It wasn't something she talked about with anyone, not even her closest friends. She had learned to accept it. She simply wasn't one to speak up, to jump into a conversation without feeling 1,000 eyes on her. She felt that wall most when she looked at the others in the room. They were all so comfortable. They spoke with ease. They smiled confidently, and they laughed like it was the most natural thing in the world. It made her wonder, as she watched them, why it was so hard for her to join in. Was there something wrong with her? Why did it always feel like it took so much energy to engage with people? But there was something else that sat heavy on her mind that night. As she glanced around the room, something in her chest fluttered. The piano, she thought. It's still here, waiting for me. It was tucked quietly in the corner of the room, half hidden by the large leafy plant that stood beside it. A beautiful grand piano, polished and gleaming under the soft light of the overhead chandelier. To anyone else, it was just a piece of furniture, another decorative item to complete the room. To her, it was much more. It had been calling to her from the moment she had walked in. She had always loved playing the piano. Had spent countless hours growing up at her own piano, lost in the music. It was the one place where she felt completely herself, the one. A space where she could express everything she couldn't put into words. But lately, even the music felt distant. It was as if something had blocked the flow. She hadn't played for anyone in so long, hadn't shared that part of herself with others. It wasn't that she didn't want to, it was just that the thought of playing in front of others filled her with paralyzing fear. The party around her continued in full swing. But the thought of that piano was a constant pull. It wasn't just the instrument. It was the dream she had kept hidden for years. She had always imagined performing, imagined sharing her music with the world. But the fear of judgment had kept her from ever taking that step. The sound of her own heart beating seemed louder than the voices around her, a constant reminder of everything she hadn't yet achieved. The applause, the acknowledgement, all of it felt like something that was always just out of her reach. A few people walked past her, laughing loudly, oblivious to her presence. She smiled at them, but it was fleeting. As they moved on, she looked back at the piano again. This time, it felt different. She wasn't just admiring it from afar. There was a small spark inside her, one that had been buried under years of doubt and fear, and it was beginning to glow. She could hear the soft notes in her head now, playing out a melody she had practiced countless times in solitude. It wasn't the most complicated piece. It was simple, soothing even, but it was hers. It had always been hers. Small piece of herself, tucked away in a song, just waiting to be played. But even as the music floated through her mind, the hesitation crept back in. What if they don't like it? What if I make a mistake? These thoughts spiraled in her head, a constant loop of doubt and self-criticism. She quickly shook them off, but it was hard. She couldn't ignore how nervous she was, how vulnerable it felt to even think about stepping in front of a crowd and playing. The conversation around her had shifted, but she hardly noticed. She was lost in the thought of the piano, in the quiet conflict between her fear and her longing. What would it be like, she wondered, to simply walk over to that piano, sit down, and let the music speak for her? Would she dare to face the judgment of others? Or would she let the moment slip away, once again blending into the background, the way she had always done? For now, she stayed silent, watching, waiting. But something inside her had shifted. The music was still calling her, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if she would ignore it anymore. The dream was starting to feel a little less distant, a little more possible. The dismissal of the evening was well underway, and Ava could still hear the faint sound of her piano echoing in her thoughts. It was just a memory now, a melody that played. In the back of her mind, as she sat quietly in the living room, nursing her drink, the hum of conversation around her was growing louder, more chaotic, and she found herself retreating once again into the background, watching the people around her as they moved from one conversation to the next. There was an energy in the air that she couldn't seem to connect to. It wasn't that she wasn't trying, she just couldn't seem to find her place among the loud laughter and chatter. She could feel herself blending into the furniture, a silent observer in a room full of people who were so comfortable with themselves. The others around her were confident, unafraid to be seen. They told stories, cracked jokes, and exchanged experiences without any hesitation. They were living in the moment, their voices bouncing off each other, feeding off the energy of the group. Ava, on the other hand, felt like she was watching life happen rather than participating in it. She wasn't part of the group. She was simply there, trying to stay invisible. Her thoughts drifted back to the piano, and for a moment she wondered if anyone else had even noticed it. The beautiful, grand instrument had been placed carefully in the corner of the room, far from the crowd, and yet it was the only thing that seemed to call to her. But playing, especially in front of others, was out of the question. There was no way she could risk it, no way she could sit down and let the music spill out of her, knowing how easily it could be judged, misunderstood, or ignored. What if they didn't like it? What if they laughed? The sound of laughter pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced around and noticed that the group nearest to her was now talking about dreams, about ambitions, about the things they hoped to achieve. She held her breath, hoping to stay unnoticed, but then one of the voices rose above the others. "So what about you, Ava?" someone asked, turning to her with a curious smile. "What's your big dream?" Ava hesitated, caught off guard. Her heart skipped a beat. For a brief moment, she felt a pang of panic. This was it. This was the moment when she would have to say something, to admit what she had always kept hidden, even from herself. Her dream wasn't like the others in the group. It wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder, writing the next great novel, or traveling the world. Her dream was simple, yet somehow it felt too fragile to share. She wanted to play music. She wanted to be heard, not just by herself but by others, to perform, to share the sound of the piano with the world. But the thought of voicing that dream out loud in front of people who couldn't possibly understand made her stomach twist. "Well," she began, her voice faltering slightly, "I've always wanted to play music, to perform. I play the piano, and I dream of doing that professionally one day." There was a long silence, and in that moment, Ava could feel the temperature of the room shift, like the air had thickened around her. She could sense the hesitation, the momentary pause in conversation that followed. Her words had hung in the air, but they didn't land the way she had hoped. There was no immediate reaction, no encouragement, just a subtle shift that made her want to shrink further into the corner. Then, to her horror, one of the men in the group let out a small, almost nervous chuckle. "You a pianist?" he said, shaking his head with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I mean, that's cute. But don't you need, like, years of training to do that? Can't just decide to play for an audience, can you?" Ava's cheeks burned, and she quickly looked away, feeling the sting of his words settle deep into her. The laughter wasn't malicious, but it was dismissive. It was the kind of laughter that didn't respect the dream but thought it was something to be laughed at, something to be brushed aside. She could feel the eyes of the others on her now, waiting for her to explain herself, to justify her dream. But she couldn't. The words felt too big, too out of place in the world they were all so comfortably inhabiting. Another voice joined in. And this time it was the woman who had asked her about her dream. She added, her tone still friendly, but laced with a gentle mockery. I just don't know how practical that is. I don't think anyone gets a chance to perform without a pretty solid career first. There was more laughter this time, louder, more insistent. Ava felt small. Her heart sank, and she quickly looked down at her glass, trying to disappear into the background again. She wanted to leave, wanted to retreat to the safety of her own mind, where no one could laugh at her dreams. But she didn't. She stayed, in the corner, silent, listening to the conversations swirl around her like a distant storm. For the rest of the evening, Ava said little. She smiled and nodded when spoken to, but her mind was far away. The laughter, the light-hearted jabs continued around her, but she wasn't part of it. She couldn't be. Her dream was too fragile, too vulnerable to withstand the dismissive comments. So she remained the quiet observer, her dream tucked away once again, hidden in the corners of her heart. But as the night wore on, the feeling of rejection lingered deep in her chest. It wasn't just the laughter. It was the realization that she had let herself believe, for even a moment, that her dream might be worth sharing. The doubt crept in, stronger than before. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was foolish to dream of a life that wasn't meant for her. But even as the doubt settled in, it was a flicker of something else, something that wouldn't let the dream die completely. The secret practice. The party faded behind her as Ava made her way back home. The weight of the evening heavy on her shoulders. She could still hear the echoes of laughter in her ears, the dismissive comments about her dream lingering in her mind. It was as if they had followed her home, still mocking her from the back of her head. She closed the door behind her with a soft click, the familiar quiet of her apartment enveloping her. She sank down on the couch for a moment, her eyes tracing the outline of the piano in the corner of the room. Stood there, silent, as if waiting for her to finally make a decision. The polished wood gleamed in the dim light of the apartment, its presence both comforting and intimidating. She hadn't touched it in weeks, too caught up in the noise of life, the weight of expectations, and more recently, the sting of rejection. For a while, she just sat there, staring at the piano, her hands folded in her lap. The music inside her felt trapped, like a dam waiting to burst, but the doubt had kept it locked away. The laughter from earlier still echoed in her ears, and she couldn't help but wonder if they were right. Was her dream foolish? Was it naive to think that she, the quiet woman who sat in the corner, could ever stand on a stage and share her music with the world? She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside, but they wouldn't go away. The dream had always felt too big, too impossible. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't the type of person who stood in front of others and commanded attention. She was the quiet observer, the one who listened, who stayed in the background. Maybe that's where she belonged. But even as the thoughts swirled in her mind, something else tugged at her, feeling she couldn't ignore. It was the quiet pull of the piano, the faint memory of the joy it had brought her in the past. She stood up slowly, almost as if on instinct, and walked toward it. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant at first, but they didn't move away. Instead, they pressed down gently, letting the first note sound, faint but clear, breaking the silence of the room. Ava closed her eyes, letting the soft sound wash over her. It was the first note of a song she had played countless times in private. The first note of a dream she had hidden away for far too long. The sound filled the space around her, and for a brief moment, it felt like the rest of the world was gone. It was just her and the music, and in that moment, she wasn't worried about what others thought. She wasn't worried about being laughed at. She was just playing. The music was simple, but it carried something deeper, something that felt too raw to explain. She had played it 1,000 times before, but tonight it felt different. It felt like a declaration. Each note felt like a step toward something bigger, something she had been too afraid to face until now. It was as if the piano was inviting her, offering her a way to express everything she had kept locked inside. As her fingers danced across the keys, the melody began to build, each note flowing more confidently, more freely. She wasn't thinking about the people at the party, the laughter, or the dismissive comments. She was just lost in the music, letting it guide her. For the first time in a long time, the fear began to fade, replaced by something more powerful. It was the joy of playing, the joy of being true to herself. She wasn't performing for anyone but herself. The music was hers, and it was enough. Song built to a crescendo, the notes growing stronger, louder. Her hands moved with purpose, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, and for the first time, she felt fully alive. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was expressing something that had been buried for too long. Something she was finally ready to share with the world. As the final notes of the song echoed through the room, Ava's fingers rested on the keys, her breath coming in short gasps. She opened her eyes, blinking back the sudden rush of emotion that had taken her by surprise. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this, how much she had needed to play. To connect with the music again, to feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with other people's opinions. She sat back, her hands still resting on the piano, the quiet hum of the notes fading into the distance. The doubt was still there, lurking in the back of her mind, but it wasn't as loud anymore. The music had quieted the noise, even if only for a moment, and that moment was enough. For the first time, Ava felt the stirrings of a decision deep inside her. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep hiding from her dream. The music inside her was too strong, too real to be ignored. It was time to stop letting fear control her, to stop letting the laughter of others determine her worth. The piano was waiting, so was her future. A subtle invitation. Next morning, the quiet of her apartment seemed even heavier than usual. The weight of the night before, the laughter, the dismissive comments, and the isolation she had felt lingered in the air like a fog that wouldn't quite lift. Ava tried to push it out of her mind, but every time she glanced at the piano, her heart sank. The memories of the party were too fresh, too sharp. How could she possibly go back out there? How could she show the world the music she had locked away for so long, when they had already laughed at her dream? She had barely touched her breakfast when her phone buzzed, breaking the silence of the room. She didn't expect it to be anything important, maybe a text from a friend, but when she unlocked her phone, she saw the name of the person who had invited her to the party. "Hey, I know last night was a bit much, but I just wanted to say how amazing it was to see you sitting at the piano. You've got something special, and honestly, I think you should play more. Now, we've got another get-together next weekend. We'd love for you to join us again. And of course, the piano's there if you feel like sharing some of that talent with us. No pressure, just thought it'd be nice." The message was short, simple, and yet it hit her like a tidal wave. She had noticed she didn't expect anyone to have been paying attention to her at all, let alone acknowledge the little moment she had shared with the piano. It felt like a lifeline thrown out into the vast ocean of her self-doubt, but the fear was still there, sharp and uncomfortable. Could she do it again? She wasn't sure. Last night had felt like an accident, a brief flash of courage that now seemed like a mistake. What if she embarrassed herself again? What if people laughed, even more so this time? But as she reread the message, something else flickered inside her, something that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just about the piano. It was about her, her dream, her voice. She put the phone down, standing in the center of the room, her gaze drawn again to the piano. She could almost hear the notes in her head, a soft melody she had been practicing in private for weeks. A simple tune, but one that made her feel like herself, one that could give her voice where words never would. The room around her felt stifling, and yet the air was lighter with each passing moment. Her pulse quickened as she thought about going back to that space, back to the piano. The invitation was subtle, gentle, even, but it felt like a challenge. A challenge she was too scared to accept, and yet something in her was stirring, demanding that she at least try. She paced around the room, biting her lip as she tried to weigh the decision. It wasn't just about playing for people. It was about sharing herself. For so long, she had hidden in the corners of her own life, too afraid to take risks, too afraid to show what lay beneath the surface. She had allowed the world to tell her she wasn't enough. The laughter at the party, though not meant to be cruel, had felt like confirmation of that fear. But maybe that was the problem. She had allowed their doubts to become her own. What if this time it was different? What if playing wasn't about proving anything to anyone, but about proving something to herself? What if it wasn't about perfection or applause, but about the act of stepping into her own truth? Her hand hovered over the phone, and she hesitated. Would she respond? Would she go back? Her fingers itched to send a simple thank you, but the words she wanted to write were different. She wasn't ready to just thank them. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to prove to herself that she could face the fear and step forward. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever was. Finally, with a deep breath, she typed, "I'll be there. I'm ready." The message felt like a promise, not to anyone else, but to herself. A promise to stop hiding, to stop letting the world decide what she was capable of. She pressed send, and for the first time in ages, Ava felt something shift inside her, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if the music would come out the way she hoped, or if she would stumble over every note. But one thing was clear. It didn't matter anymore. The piano was waiting. Her dreams were waiting, and this time she was ready to step into them, no matter how uncertain the road might be. She stood, finally turning toward the piano. The keys were silent for now, but Ava knew that would change soon. It was time. The first note the day of the next gathering arrived with a mix of anticipation and dread swirling in Ava's chest. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress one last time, though her reflection seemed foreign to her. It wasn't just the outfit, it was her. She felt different. There was a shift in her spirit, something small yet undeniable. Her hand trembled as she smoothed her hair, a wave of nerves rushing through her. What if I mess up? What if they're just humoring me? The questions raced through her mind, but she swallowed them down. No more second guessing. I'm doing this. Ava arrived at the house, the familiar hum of chatter greeting her as soon as she walked through the door. The laughter, the noise, it felt bigger than before, but somehow this time she didn't feel so small. She smiled at the people who greeted her, nodding in acknowledgement, but her eyes kept drifting to the piano in the corner of the room. The same one that had haunted her thoughts all week, standing there like an invitation she had only just begun to understand. The piano, with its deep, rich wood and gleaming keys, felt like a silent challenge, waiting for her to step up and claim it. For a brief second, Ava wanted to turn and walk out the door. She almost did. Her feet felt like they were stuck to the floor, frozen by fear. But then she heard the faintest whisper in the back of her mind. You've already taken the first step. You owe it to yourself to take the next one. With a deep breath, Ava made her way to the piano, her heart pounding in her chest. The soft sounds of the party faded as she approached. She didn't feel like she was walking into a room full of people anymore. She felt like she was walking into a place where she could finally be herself. When she reached the bench, she took another deep breath, her hands resting lightly on the keys. Her fingers were trembling, but it wasn't the fear of playing anymore. It was the fear of being seen. She glanced around. People were chatting, but some had noticed her approach. A few turned their heads, curious, but none of them looked at her with judgment. No one laughed. No one mocked her. They weren't waiting for her to fail. They were waiting to hear her. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, the music from the party around her fading completely. All that remained was the stillness of the moment, the breath she was holding, the heartbeat she could feel in her throat. Then, without thinking, she pressed her fingers to the keys. The first note was soft, barely a whisper, but it broke through the quiet in the room like the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness. Her fingers moved gently, feeling the cool ivory beneath them. drawing out a melody she had played 1,000 times before in the privacy of her mind. The song wasn't complicated, but it had always been her favorite. The melody was simple and pure, yet full of emotion, just like the way she had always felt about her music, her dream. It was her, woven into every note. As the music filled the room, she felt a shift within herself. The doubts, the fears, the years of hiding suddenly, they didn't matter. For the first time, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply playing for herself. Her fingers glided over the keys, each note an extension of her heart, a reflection of everything she had kept locked away. Ava didn't look up at first. She didn't need to. But as the melody swelled, something inside her urged her to lift. Her gaze, slowly, she opened her eyes and glanced around the room. The chatter had stopped. The room, once filled with noise, was now still. The people who had been lost in their conversations were now standing, moving closer, drawn to the sound. Of the piano? It wasn't just the music they were listening to her. Not as a quiet observer in the corner, not as the woman who had been too afraid to speak. They were listening to her. Her heart raced, but the fear that had held her back for so long seemed to fade. Each note brought her more confidence, more freedom. She played with a growing sense of ease, the music now flowing from her as naturally as breathing. It wasn't perfect. There were moments where her fingers slipped, where the melody faltered, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was playing, sharing, expressing herself in a way she never thought possible. Ava felt the energy in the room shift. It wasn't just the sound of her music that had drawn everyone in, it was the vulnerability, the honesty in each note. They weren't just listening to a song, they were listening to her soul. For the first time, she realized that her dream wasn't just about playing the piano. It was about sharing a part of herself, about showing the world that her dreams were valid, that she was valid. And as she reached the final chords, a moment of perfect clarity washed over her. The music lingered in the air, a final note that hung between them all. She let her hands rest on the keys, the room now filled with a heavy silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Ava didn't dare to break the quiet. It was a moment, suspended in time, a moment where she had truly been seen, where the music had connected her with the world she had always kept at arm's length. Finally, the silence broke, not with awkward chatter, but with the soft sound of clapping. The applause was gentle at first, a hesitant ripple, but it quickly grew louder, more heartfelt. People began to step forward, some offering their congratulations. Others simply standing there, stunned by the depth of what she had shared. Ava's heart swelled, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude filling her chest. She had done it. She had played. And in doing so, she had stepped into the woman she had always dreamed of becoming. As she stood from the piano, her legs weak from the emotional release, she realized that this moment wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The next step had already been taken. The room falls silent. The sound of Ava's last note hung in the air like a lingering breath, the soft echo of the final chord still vibrating through the space. As her fingers left the keys, she felt a strange sensation. The weight of the room had shifted. It was no longer the buzzing, chaotic space she had walked into hours ago. No, everything was quiet. The usual clinking of glasses, the hum of background conversation, the laughter, all of it was gone, replaced by an almost tangible silence. Ava didn't know whether to look up or keep her gaze focused on the piano. She didn't know what to expect next. Her heart was still racing, her chest tight from the emotions that had poured out during the song. But the silence around her made her uneasy. Was it a bad silence? Was it uncomfortable? Was it judgment? She dared to lift her eyes. The room hadn't moved. Everyone was still standing or sitting where they had been, but now their attention was entirely focused on her. There were no more distractions, no more small talk. They were all watching her, waiting, but not with skepticism. There was no laughter or mockery. There was something else, something she hadn't expected. Respect. Awe, even. She felt the room pulling her in. The eyes of strangers turned into something warmer, more inviting. Her mind spun with the realization they weren't just listening to the music. They were listening to her. A subtle shift occurred as people began to draw closer. The space between her and the others closed, not with awkwardness, but with a kind of reverence. Some of the people who had been loud and boisterous before now stood quietly, their expressions softening. One person even moved forward, pausing. At the edge of the piano bench, as if unsure whether to speak or not, there was no need to break the silence. It was a silence filled with understanding. The woman who had asked her to play earlier, the one who had encouraged her, was the first to step forward. She looked at Ava with something like admiration in her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle, but full of emotion. I had no idea," she said, almost breathless. "You should play more. That was beautiful." Words felt like a promise, not just of praise, but of something deeper. Recognition of Ava's talent that hadn't been given the room to grow until now. Ava's throat tightened. She hadn't expected such a heartfelt reaction. There had been a part of her that feared the worst, that they would laugh, or worse, patronize her. But the room hadn't reacted with mockery or indifference. Instead, they seemed to have been swept up in the same vulnerability that she had felt while playing. More people began to approach, their faces reflecting the same quiet respect. The man who had laughed at her dream earlier was now standing nearby, his expression unreadable. Ava wasn't sure if he would say anything, but he did. His voice, when it came, was quieter than usual, with none of the arrogance she'd heard before. "That was something else," he said, his words slower than usual. "You have a gift. I didn't know." His eyes met hers then, and for the first time, there was no trace of dismissal, no trace of mockery. Instead, he looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. Ava felt a surge of gratitude, but it was mixed with confusion. Why was this moment so different? Why had this crowd, this group of people who hadn't even noticed her an hour ago, suddenly shifted so dramatically? She wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't expected this kind of reaction. She hadn't expected anyone to really hear her, to understand the meaning of the music that had poured from her heart. The silence continued. But it wasn't uncomfortable now. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness or uncertainty. It was the silence of connection, of shared understanding. Ava didn't know what to do with that kind of silence. She had spent so long hiding in the background, so long wondering if she was enough, that she didn't know how to exist in this new space. But as she sat there, still processing the unexpected response, she realized something. This was the moment she had always been waiting for. Not the applause, not the praise, but the recognition that her music, her dream, was not just her own. It was something that could connect her to others in ways she had never imagined. She hadn't come here to prove herself. She hadn't come to show off or to impress. She had come because, for the first time, she had decided to stop hiding. And in that decision, she had given herself something more than just an audience. She had found a connection. She took a slow, steady breath, trying to calm the rush of emotions that were still swirling inside her. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't the same person who had walked into this room. The woman who had hidden in the shadows, afraid to share her music, was gone. In her place was someone who had shared a piece of herself, who had stepped forward and found not rejection, but acceptance. The quiet in the room still held, but now it was filled with something new. It wasn't just admiration or surprise. It was respect, silent promise that her dream wasn't foolish, that it had a place in this world, a place she had always belonged in. The emotional shift, Ava sat still, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, the final notes still hanging in the air. The world around her seemed to blur, the sounds of the room becoming distant. It wasn't just the music that had filled the space. It was the shared experience of vulnerability, of being seen in a way she never thought possible. The applause had come, yes, but it wasn't the clapping that felt like the acknowledgement. It was something deeper, something she had never felt before. The room was different. Not in the way she had imagined it would be, with polite, obligatory applause and quick compliments. No, this was different. People weren't just clapping for her music, they were clapping for her bravery. They had seen something in her that she hadn't even fully recognized in herself. And that realization was both overwhelming and humbling. A few moments passed, and the sound of the room began to creep back in soft laughter, murmurs of approval, the rustling of people shifting their weight or moving closer to her. But it wasn't as loud as before. It wasn't chaotic. It was quieter now, almost reverent. Ava didn't know how to process it. She had never been the center of attention, never in a way that felt meaningful. She had always thought of herself as the quiet observer, the one who existed on the edges, watching, but never truly participating. Now, though, the energy around her had changed. They weren't seeing her as the quiet woman in the corner. They were seeing her for who she was, a person with something valuable to share. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about the raw honesty, the courage to put her soul out into the world, regardless of how it might be received. And then, as if the room itself had been waiting for something to happen, the air shifted. One person stepped forward, a woman Ava recognized, though they had never spoken much before. Her face was open, filled with admiration, her eyes brighter than they had been moments ago. "That was," she began, her voice catching slightly. She took a breath and tried again. "That was beautiful. I had no idea. You're incredible." The simplicity of the words struck Ava harder than she expected. Incredible. A word she never thought anyone would use to describe her, especially when it came to her music. Ava's hands rested on the keys, feeling the weight of her fingers, pressing into them, but she didn't speak. She couldn't, her throat was too tight. Someone else from the group, a man who had been leaning against the far wall during the performance. Arms folded, skeptical, moved closer, his expression now softer. He offered a smile, but it wasn't the patronizing smile she had once seen. It was real. "You really have something," he said, his voice low, almost in awe. "I didn't think it had hit me like that. It was like it wasn't just music. It was a feeling, something deeper." Her heart fluttered in her chest as she looked at him. This wasn't the same man who had laughed at her dream just hours earlier. This was someone who had seen her differently, who had heard her, really heard her. Ava's lips parted, but she didn't know what to say. There were no words for this moment, no words that could adequately explain how much this meant to her. She hadn't expected anything like this, hadn't expected to feel seen in a way that didn't come with judgment or criticism. As more people gathered around, offering kind words and quiet compliments, Ava felt something inside her shift. She wasn't just the woman who had hidden in the corner anymore. She wasn't just the observer. She was part of something now. Moment of shared vulnerability and connection. She had given them a piece of herself, and in return they had given her something just as valuable: acceptance. A few more minutes passed, and slowly the crowd began to thin out, but the feeling in the room lingered. Ava's mind was spinning with the realization that this wasn't just about music. This was about her finally allowing herself to be heard, and the room had embraced it, had embraced her. She took a deep breath and stood, still a little dazed from the overwhelming emotions that had surged through her. Hands ached slightly from playing, but in a way that felt satisfying. The applause had died down, but there was something else that remained, a quiet hum of connection that seemed to fill the space. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had gathered to listen. They weren't just strangers anymore. They were people who had been a part of this moment, a part of her music, and a part of the quiet courage she had found in herself. Ava wasn't sure how long she stood there, basking in the quiet understanding that surrounded her. But when she finally turned away from the piano, she knew that this was a turning point, a moment that had shifted everything. She wasn't just a woman with a hidden dream anymore. She was someone who had shown the world that her music was worth hearing, and more than that, she had finally started to believe that herself. The rebirth of confidence. The night was slipping away, but the air in the room felt different, lighter, almost electric. Ava was still standing near the piano, the sensation of the performance still settling over her like a gentle wave. The sounds of conversation around her had returned, but this time they were softer, more intentional, filled with the warmth of genuine appreciation. She had played, truly played, and the world hadn't swallowed her whole. Instead, they had opened up, accepted her, and strangely made her feel like she belonged. Her heart still raced in the aftermath, but there was a deep sense of calm. Beneath it, like the first time the storm subsided and the air turned still. She looked around, surprised by the way people were looking at her now. It wasn't the same as before. Gone were the glances of indifference and quiet judgment. There were smiles, nods of respect, and the soft murmur of people discussing. Her music, not her as a person, but the music itself, the emotion that had come with it. It wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about feeling the song. It's about connecting through the sound. Ava felt as though a weight had been lifted off her chest. All the years of hiding, of thinking her dreams were too foolish to share, had melted away in that one beautiful moment of vulnerability. The piano had been her secret, a part of herself that no one else had ever truly seen. But now, with the music still lingering in the air, she felt like she had opened a door to a new version of herself, a version that could be seen. She had been prepared to go unnoticed. She had been ready to sit quietly in the corner again, too. Let the world move on without her. But instead something had shifted. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't waiting to be discovered. She was here. She was present. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the guests, a woman who had been in the crowd, approached her with a warm smile. She had been quiet during the performance, but now, as she stepped closer to Ava, there was an unmistakable look of admiration in her eyes. "You know," the woman began, her voice soft but filled with sincerity, I don't think I've ever heard anything so raw. It was like you weren't just playing music, you were telling us something. I didn't expect to feel like that tonight." Ava blinked, surprised by the emotion in the woman's voice. She wasn't just complimenting her performance. She was talking about the connection, the way the music had reached something deeper. Ava's heart gave a little flutter. That was what she had been hoping for, not just applause, but understanding. The woman continued, her eyes still shining. "You really should play more. Don't keep that to yourself. People need to hear you." Ava smiled, though the words caught in her throat. People need to hear you. It wasn't the first time someone had said something like that, but this time, it felt different. It felt real. She had never truly believed her music could touch others in that way, but now she understood. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about making everything just right. It was about being honest, being human, and allowing others to see that honesty. Right. That was what connected her to the room, to the people around her. She glanced around. Again, and this time, the room felt different. People weren't just talking to her as an acquaintance anymore. They were speaking to her as someone who had shared something important. She wasn't just Ava, the quiet observer. She wasn't the girl who had been laughed at for her dreams. She was a musician, a person who had a voice that mattered. And the people around her saw it. The man who had initially dismissed her dream was now standing by the punch bowl, holding a glass in his hand and watching her intently. She caught his eye, and this time, there was no sarcastic smile, no quick dismissal. Just a subtle nod, a gesture of understanding. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She smiled back, knowing that in this quiet exchange something had changed. She felt it in her chest, the first stirrings of confidence. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't about proving herself. It was something more grounding, something that came from within. A quiet certainty that had always been there, buried beneath years of self-doubt. Ava realized that she didn't need the approval of others to pursue her dreams. Her dream was valid simply because it was hers. She wasn't doing this for applause or validation anymore. She was doing it because it was what she loved. A small but powerful thought took root in her mind. Maybe I'm not just meant to be a quiet observer anymore. Maybe I'm meant to share my music. Maybe I'm meant to stand here and be seen. As the night went on and people came and went, Ava found herself not retreating into the background. She wasn't hiding anymore. She engaged in conversations with more ease, laughed a little more freely, and even made small talk with those who had once felt distant. It wasn't that she had changed overnight. It was that something inside her had shifted. She had stepped into her own story, and now she was finally ready to be a part of it. When it was time to leave, she said her goodbyes with a smile, not the hesitant smile of the girl who had entered the party, unsure of her place. No, this time, Her smile was one of quiet pride, a reflection of the new strength she had found within herself. She walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, her steps lighter than they had been before. There was a new rhythm in her pulse, one that matched the beat of the song that still played in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, it didn't scare her. She was ready. The music was ready, and whatever came next, she would face it with the same honesty she had shown tonight. The world had been waiting for her to step into it, and now she was finally doing it. The next step, the night air was crisp as Ava walked home, her steps light, almost as if the ground beneath her had softened. The events of the evening still echoed in her mind, each moment replaying in her head like a familiar song she couldn't stop listening to. She felt the cool breeze kiss her cheeks, but it couldn't compare to the warmth in her chest. The quiet thrill of stepping into a version of herself she hadn't known existed until now, for the first time in years. She felt grounded in her own skin, confident not because she had been validated, but because she had finally allowed herself to be. As she reached her apartment building, Ava couldn't help but look up at the stars, scattered across the sky like diamonds. They seemed closer tonight, as if they were a reminder that no dream was too far, no goal too high. She had spent so long hiding from herself, from the fear of judgment, but now she realized something simple. Her dreams were worth pursuing. When she entered her apartment, the quiet of the space felt different, no longer felt empty, no longer felt like it was just a place where she hid from the world. It felt like a home, a space where she could truly be herself. Her eyes immediately moved to the piano, sitting silently in the corner, but this time it wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was her partner in this journey. It had always been waiting for her, and now she was ready to play again. The room was still, and for the first time in a long time, Ava didn't feel alone. The weight of the night, the music, the people, the experience had lifted something. Inside her, she wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't scared to share her voice, to let the world hear her. The woman who had walked into that party so unsure of herself wasn't the same woman who was standing in her living room now. Ava sat at the piano, her fingers brushing the keys softly at first, feeling their cool surface, grounding herself in the rhythm. The song she had played earlier still lingered in her mind, but now she was no longer playing it for anyone. It was for herself. She closed her eyes, letting her fingers move with ease, following the melody that had always been there. Waiting for her to acknowledge it, the music filled the space around her, the notes coming more easily now. As her fingers glided across the keys, a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't performing. She wasn't worried about anyone's reaction. She was simply playing, and it felt like freedom. The music was no longer a burden or something to hide. It was a part of her, just as much as anything else. And for the first time, she embraced it fully as she finished the song. She sat back, her hands still resting on the keys, and let the silence settle around her. It was a silence filled with something new, something she hadn't felt before. Peace. She wasn't worried about judgment. She wasn't worried about whether anyone would ever hear her play again. What mattered now was that she had found her voice not for others, but for herself. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below, feeling the night wrap around her. For the first time in a long time, Ava didn't feel like she was on the outside looking in. She had taken a step into the world, shared her music, and in doing so, found a connection she hadn't even known she was seeking. The applause, the compliments, those were fleeting. What remained, what had changed her, was the quiet confidence she had discovered within herself. Ava didn't know what the future held, but tonight she realized that the future had always been hers to shape. The music had always been hers to share. And this was just the beginning. She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She wasn't waiting for validation. No, she had already given that to herself. And in that moment, Ava knew the next step wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. The world had always been waiting for her to step forward, and tonight she had taken that first step. The rest would follow, one note, one song, one dream at a time.